All right, here we are for another episode of The Goalpost. So it's yes, we brought this one. Was it 1 week back, wasn't it? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
we
It's a
brought it
week
1 week
later.
back. There was a bit of a really minor emergency uh, that I had to kind of attend to, but everything's okay. Let's just say
That's
that.
good.
So,
Yeah, that's the main thing. These things happen. So
mhm.
yes, no, cool. So you were going to mention a particular author who was quite early on with talking about men's rights issues, I believe.
Yeah. Well, since Peter brought back a article, I don't know if it's a new thing he wrote really quick or something that he brought back up from the past, but it's concerning Esther Villar, the woman who
Yes,
blew the lid off of gynocentrism and got punished for it.
that's exactly right. That's
Mhm.
right.
Right, yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, I'll be sure to well, are we allowed to put links from AVFM on YouTube?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's
Okay.
only Facebook that's banned.
Hmm.
Yes, if anyone doesn't know, if you try to put a link onto Facebook, if you try to put a link from AVFM onto Facebook, it will not let you. Originally, and this is also true even in a chat, originally, when you tried, it basically broke your entire message. Such
Oh,
a, I did it a couple of times, and even after I discovered it a couple of times, I did it, without sort of really thinking about it, and you couldn't actually delete the message at all. I think they may have fixed that now, but it was
mm,
kind of silly. This message would sit there in this sort of broken state where you couldn't present it and also couldn't delete it. Anyway,
right, yeah.
yeah. So the list of banned topics on Facebook includes it says a few thousand people on it. I think includes a few Nazis, and it includes Paul Elam and Voice for Men is on there as well.
Mm,
So a bit ridiculous.
right, yeah, because we looked apart.
Exactly. I'll tell you what, exactly. As I said, I'm an extreme moderate, and I think that's probably a reasonable position for most people who are involved with men's rights.
Right, sure, yeah. And I'm the libertarian guy here, but they think libertarians are fascists, so.
There you go. Exactly. So it all makes sense. That's
Mm.
right.
Right, yeah. But back to the point, I'm going to go ahead and, if I don't forget, I'm going to include the link to the new article on the low bar of this video.
Yes.
But just wanted to just give it a mention because I don't think we've ever talked about it. Esther Villar. Correct me if I'm wrong, folks. But yeah,
You're right.
so yeah, I'm just going to briefly run through the article. It's not that long. It's just a few words and uh, newspaper article attached right to it. So
Mm.
and Peter Wright's the one that published the article. When Esther Villar published her book, The Manipulated Man, she was beaten up by four young women in the toilet of Munich State Library who were angry about her perspectives. Speaking to the, we're concerned about the violence against women, but of course they can't harm a soul, can they?
Exactly.
All right.
So I don't just a slight divergence there. If you're okay with that, I don't know actually, Vernon, if I've ever mentioned this to you, but a female MRA in Australia was actually assaulted about 3 or 4 years ago. A friend of
Mm-hmm.
mine, and yeah, she was accosted on the street and assaulted. They pushed her and punched her and so forth, and they made specific references to her activism and being anti-feminist. So
Uh,
this sort of thing still goes on. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. I won't say any names. She doesn't like it to be mentioned publicly, but they were their
All right.
names. So,
Yeah, so I won't ask.
so
Right, yeah. But yeah, check out the article, folks. Again, it'll be linked on the description.
no, that's great. Yes. So I haven't read The Manipulated Man, and now that you've reminded me of this, I'm going to go and do it because I did sort of have it on my to-do list.
Right.
So there are some great books that have been written, and people have figured these things out. Like we're talking right back into the 1970s here. People understood these things, even though most of society still hasn't picked up on concepts like gynocentrism. But yes, I shall definitely be reading Esther Villar's book, The Manipulated Man.
Is it well available?
That's a good question. Now, I think, I have a feeling that there's a copy floating around somewhere. But yes, I'll find out, and we'll see if we can. Oh yeah, it's got an ISBN here. I'm not sure it's in publication at the moment. but we'll find out what we can, find out how readily accessible it is. But
Sure.
yeah. But I'm fairly certain there's a copy floating around in our community.
Sure, yeah.
So
Yeah. Maybe in digital format, maybe.
Possibly, that's right. Exactly. I'm not sure what the situation is with the copyright. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had a few items too.
Exactly. So all my items probably come under the broad heading of clown world, and this is, of course, a topic we talk about, from time to time. So just tonight, actually, I saw an article here in the mass mainstream media in Australia, and the article itself probably is nothing special, but it's basically it was some women, principally feminists, complaining about the loss of female spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is quite interesting because men have been losing their single-sex spaces for decades. So, for example, in near where I live, there's a men's club called the Tattersall, formerly men's club called the Tattersalls Club, and it got a lot of pushback from being a men's-only club for a long time. And about 3 or 4 years ago, they finally voted to include women as well. But meanwhile, there's an even more exclusive women's club called the Morton Club that nobody ever talks about. And there's a lot of clubs like that around the world. There's a couple local to me, but the Morton Club's very, very exclusive, women only, and it remains women only to the present time. Although, as far as I know, no trans women have tried to enter. It would be interesting to see what happens if they did.
Right.
But
there's probably not much of them to try, compared to the other way around.
Well, that's right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And it's quite possible. I mean, maybe they have, but I haven't seen anything publicly mentioned about it. The Morton Club is quite exclusive, though, and I suspect if anything happened, they'd probably try to keep it on the down low if possible. But anyway, I found, interestingly enough, in the comments for this article, though, there were a lot of men basically coming in and saying men have been losing their single-sex spaces for a long time. Too bad, so sad. That's pretty much what it amounted to. I think there's a lot of men out there who are absolutely sick of it.
Absolutely. And they can't, these people who are complaining about this sort of thing, and I'm talking about the women are losing their spaces people, they can't use the men are dangerous argument like this, because if women have been invading dangerous men's spaces, well, they wouldn't be because they were dangerous. And
that's a good argument. That's
right. Exactly. They enter places where everybody is dangerous and nothing happens.
Yes.
But one thing, one biological male is a threat.
Yes, for some reason. That's right.
Yes, exactly.
That's right. Yeah. Well, we've always said feminism is not known for its internal consistency.
No, not for a second. Yeah. Well, that is the consistent part, is that they're never consistent.
Never consistent. That's right. Exactly. Yes, we do laugh at. I think probably people who aren't aware of the history may seem to them that sometimes we're quite harsh about these things. But honestly, when you've been dealing with this for years on end, sometimes some people decades on end, and you've seen the crazy, and you've seen how long the crazy's been going on, and how long the hate's been going on. It's. I think you eventually get to a point where you just got to laugh at them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, if they weren't a direct threat to our lives and our liberties, I think I'd laugh a little bit more.
You're right. Absolutely. We do laugh from time to time, but yes,
because we have to.
Sometimes. Yeah. Exactly. You got to let off some steam, but yes. And this is the real problem. And they are changing the laws, and they're even among feminists. And I've said this many, many times. The majority of feminists they tend towards being quite gynocentric, but in many other ways, they're often quite reasonable people, but they know very little about feminism. It's the feminist leaders and the feminist activists, and they're driving it along. And I encourage anyone who calls themselves a feminist, to read about feminism, read about the last few decades, and even going right back to the Declaration of Sentiments and so forth. Chances are most feminists haven't even heard of that. Look up what the Declaration of Sentiments is. It's essentially the origin of modern feminism.
Right. One thought I had recently, actually just yesterday, is the difference between a feminist and a radical feminist. So here's what I came up with. The difference between a feminist and a radical feminist is that a feminist doesn't know that there isn't really a difference.
Nice. I like that. We might have to put that on Wiki for Men, actually.
Okay, sure.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like yeah, the elegant self-referential nature of it. That's very good. Yes.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that a lot in the comments. I mean, wasn't a men's rights group or an anti-feminist group. It was just a mainstream media, and a lot of the men were coming in and saying, too bad. This has been happening to men for decades, and you didn't care.
Right, and they complain about those kind of comments too. They still don't think that either this happens or is a big deal. When women enter men's spaces.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Whereas my view, and I've maintained this consistently for a very, very long time, as long as I can remember on the subject, both or neither. If society decides that there are to be no single-sex spaces, personally that doesn't bother me. Fine, we don't have them. But if we are to have them, we need to have both. So.
Right. Exactly. And one thing I want to kind of follow up on immediately is that even the conservative types are so eager to kind of jump on the white knighting bandwagon and come to defend. Since when did they defend women's sports of all things? Right? Like
it's produced an interesting unholy alliance, hasn't it? They've suddenly come to the defense of feminists after decades of criticizing them. Yeah,
exactly. It was one thing. So, do you know who J.P. Sears is? Kind of a sort of an anti-woke kind of a guy. Yeah, right. I saw him and I just can't because he thought he was being clever, right? We need to ban women from women's sports was a tweet he did, right? Kind of referencing this whole thing, but then I did a retweet of it and said, and make them actually interesting to watch, the horror. So banning women from women's sports might be good for the sport.
I never thought of that. That's performance levels would improve. And
yeah,
I like it. I never thought of that. That's
right.
Great.
Yeah, right.
So I guess the next item I have on my list now, it's actually quite serious. This woman by the name of Jen Angel. I don't know. It's only come up only happened in the last week or so. Quite serious. This woman by the name of Jen Angel, who's her friends described her as a social justice activist. I would probably say social justice warrior would be a reasonable position. Now, Angel has passed away. She was basically, not carjacked. That's not the right term. Two men approached her and smashed the window of her car and stole her purse. And anyway, she has got out of the car and she has made chase again and follow these men. They've got into a car and tried to sort of head off. She's actually got tangled up in the door and dragged for about 50 feet or about 17 meters down the road. And during this period, she struck her head. She was rushed to hospital and she was declared dead a few days later on. So, but what's obviously very sad for Miss Angel, who's as I said, but it's interesting. It's interesting to look at this. A little bit's come out about this now. Her friends. It's turned out that she's an anarchist and and also a social justice activist. And her friends have basically called on the state to not punish the people who killed her in a traditional manner. So I'll describe how her friends described her. So they put up a GoFundMe. I'm not sure what the GoFundMe is for, maybe for funeral expenses or something like that. But they've said about her, as a longtime social movement activist and anarchist, Jen did not believe in state violence, carceral punishment or incarceration as an effective or just solution to social violence and inequity. And so they have called on the state to not punish the very violent offenders who stole from her and ultimately, acted in this manner that resulted in her death. And instead they want something called restorative justice, which this is a new term on me and something I'm going to be researching. But it seems like they're looking at wanting to sit down and talk to the people and talk to them about what they did was wrong and all this sort of thing. So it'd be interesting. I don't know if you know much about restorative justice, but it's something I'll be looking into. Anyway, she's also an anarchist and she founded an organization, which is something I want to talk about too. So anyway, just interesting that it's obviously a very unfortunate situation, but it is interesting what's come out of this, of her friends calling on even after the death of their friend, they're saying that the two men who did this should not be punished in a traditional sense. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, it's one of those things where it's where you want to start, kind of a thing, you know. So, right. So the problem is, if she's a social justice warrior and calls herself an anarchist, she's probably not in any kind of she wasn't in any anti-state kind of mentality in any meaningful sort of a way. It's probably, you know, those kind of people tend to call upon the state for whenever it's convenient, unless she was even extra sincere about that. But usually they're kind of on the communist side of things instead of the more capitalist kind of free market type of anarchism. That there's kind of a divide in those kind of in these particular worlds.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, that's right, because that's right. There can be, as you say, well, would they use the term anarchist? Like someone who believes in, say, laissez-faire economics or something?
It's a mix.
Right. Okay. So some people would say anarchist. Okay.
Right. Some people would say it, and you know, because of the stigma attached to the term, for better or worse, some kind of shy off from using it, but some do. Some use voluntarist instead as an alternative.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
But we're not really talking about that. We're talking about this situation. So if she were like a different variety of anarchist, instead of having her car broken in, she probably would have shot them in self-defense.
Yeah, she's not that sort of voluntarist. Yes, right.
Exactly. Yeah. But I know what you mean.
What's that? Sorry.
No, I know what you mean about what's going on. Yeah. I'm just kind of rattling off thoughts straight off about it.
No, that's good, because that's right. We didn't talk about this at all before, which we normally, you know. So sometimes we mention things beforehand. On this particular occasion, I hadn't mentioned anything about this. So sort of, in a sense, you're going cold on this particular topic. Yeah, I find it interesting. I didn't realize that, actually, because to me, the term, when you're saying that, say some libertarians might use terms like anarchist, because to me, an anarchist is very much on the type of person that Jen Angel would probably be, which is that they're anti-state. As you say, there is a tendency towards relying on the state when it's convenient. And I have to say, I believe passionately in internal consistency. So if you really are an anarchist and really believe that the state is something, there's something fundamentally wrong with it, you ought not to call on the state then when you need help, because obviously you would find the state objectionable.
Yeah.
I mean, to be clear, there's no case that Jen Angel in this case did attempt to pursue the people on her own, and that unfortunately resulted in her death. But I do find it interesting. So moving on to with this anarchist aspect, it's interesting. This is just my perception of anarchy, and I understand that it's probably fairly broad from what you're saying. And
yeah, it is.
She helped found an organization, which I just found the idea of an anarchist organization to be sort of amusing, because in a sense, anarchy should oppose organization in a certain sense.
Right.
Or as I guess oppose a state opposed organization. But she did actually form an organization called Agency. I just thought the idea of an anarchist organization was interesting.
Right. Yeah. Well, some people kind of use the word to mean chaos, but some people use it to mean not no rulers, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of nuance to be found on that one. It's kind of hard to put it into one simple kind of discussion. It takes several discussions, I think.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, the whole idea of no rule, I mean, I have encountered that before. The Australian Greens Party for a long time had no official leader. They had somebody who was a de facto leader. In the end, after a few years, they just finally gave up and just named him the leader, because that's what he was in everything except name. So, but I do find it interesting. I mean, that's right. If you have no leaders, I mean, I suppose you could operate completely through consensus decision making.
Well, yeah. One thing though, when they mean rulers, they usually mean a state ruler, like a self-imposed kind of ruler, instead of somebody that's. So, I've always kind of I'm evoking this kind of image of the leader actually being a part of the group that they're leading and kind of working kind of together, except that he's taking kind of like the example role, which is kind of different from a bureaucrat, say. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so that's right. So, okay, taking that position on anarchy, it's not necessarily that there isn't a functioning, there isn't a functioning system. It's just that the system is trying to reduce hierarchy or even not have a hierarchy.
Of sorts. It's really complicated. And it's been a long while since I broached the subject, because I've been focusing on men's issues more.
Yeah. No, fair enough. And as I said, we're doing... Yeah, no, that's cool. We're doing this cold. Yeah, but I do think that Jen Angel is probably the type of anarchist that is largely anti-statist, I suspect. I mean, her friends, for example, did say that Jen did not believe in state violence, which is interesting because the state, of course, the modern state has a monopoly on force. So you have the army and police. Obviously, the USO probably somewhat different situation. But yeah, I think that's what they're getting. Perhaps she was getting at there. Her friends are getting at in relation to her views there.
I see. Yeah.
But, yeah.
Right.
Anyway,
and the more libertarian side of anarchy kind of focuses more on the privatization of some of those sources, so not the elimination thereof, basically, like more localized sort of governments, I think.
Yes, whereas I personally wouldn't. I mean, this isn't an area that I would say I'm anywhere near an expert in. But I wouldn't use the term anarchist there. I would use the term more likely libertarian or something like that.
It's very, very complicated. There's a mix. There's a big debate as to what's the right thing to call and what actually is this or that. Some say minarchist, but I don't know if I like that term too much.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I have heard that term, although I don't think I could have given you a definition. So. But anyway, there we are. So so it's just a few different interesting aspects there. Obviously, very sad situation, and the offenders are still outstanding as far as I know. Yeah. But I just do find it interesting that her friends have said that, have come out that way. Obviously, I'm sure that's not going to happen, and they will be prosecuted if they're found. They'll be prosecuted in the conventional manner. But yeah, it's interesting, and
yeah,
I don't know what your feeling is on say imprisonment. I tend to feel that I think there's evidence that turning up the heat and trying to imprison people more hasn't been a very successful approach. There being like the UK or England, I guess it would have been in the 18th century, tried this extensively. The crime rate was spiraling, and they kept they kept punishing more people, and the crime rate went up again, and so forth. And it didn't end up succeeding. Partly the reason Australia exists actually is because their prisons were overflowing. But I do find it interesting that. So I personally, I've tended towards trying to use prison as sort of a last resort for violent offenders and uncontrollable offenders and so forth, and hoping that the system can find alternatives for those offenders where it's appropriate.
Right. Well, I was thinking back on the restorative justice thing that you were mentioning about that they were trying, those friends were trying to do, but the problem is it's so on one hand we have this over imprisonment, which is not really what you call a deterrent at this point, but then the approach that these people are trying to do with the restorative justice thing is just too lenient, I think. There's got to be that fine balance of accountability, basically, right? But
absolutely,
right.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply at all that they're being too lenient at all. Just appropriate function, like for example, community service. If you could, for example, a non-violent offender, if they agree to community service with the sanction that if they fail to achieve perform properly on the community service, there could be a imprisonment as a punishment. They could be returned to prison or something, but using community service as an alternative or something like that in cases where it's safe to do so, and they're able to, and that's able to work. But yes, I think that then you get the other extreme where, as you say, this restorative justice, where they're probably just being too lenient, where it seems to me that they're almost saying, let's just sit down and talk to these people, talk about why what they did was wrong, which just isn't going to work for some people, unfortunately.
It almost works as well as teach men not to rape.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So I had more thoughts on the prison thing, because there's no real kind of persuasion in a philosophical sense that what they did was wrong, because it's really hard to do it, especially after the fact. But where was I going with this? Basically, I think a society, see, this is the part where I think a lot of people who are kind of hung up on punishment first kind of a mentality kind of get caught on, is that, they don't realize that the more free a society is, the less incentive to violence there is to begin with for crime, I suppose. That's kind of what I kind of tend to see. People think that more freedom means more chaos, and some would say anarchy. But But the more freedom means more opportunity, more things to do peacefully, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So, we don't have to resort to, no one should ever have to resort to instigated violence, aggression. This is what we call the non-aggression principle here in the voluntarist world, the libertarian world. But it's just one of those things that more freedom tends to solve a lot of things. Yeah, but after a crime has been committed, and these things should be well established. I suggest doing away with victimless crimes. Like knock it off with throwing people in jail for marijuana, and now we're getting more invented crimes like misogyny. so the future kind of looks kind of bleak here, because we can just throw them in jail for just about everything. If they're men, maybe the women, of course, will probably get away with much worse.
And there is, as we know, a movement in many countries to abolish women's prisons, either to abolish almost all women's prisons and only have some feminists, for example, argued there should only be, say, one women's prison in a country for the truly uncontrollable, prisoners. There are others who say that women should never be imprisoned, and that there was a government report in the UK some years ago, and they said that all the women's prisons should be closed down, and that one advantage of this is it would free up more space for men's prisons because they could be converted.
Right?
Isn't that great? Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, you're right. It's very gendered.
Well, when it comes to the feminists, I'm trying to think of what their definition of a really uncontrollable woman is, and I can only think of one thing. It's probably just like anti-feminist women that they're going to throw in.
Yeah, you're probably right. Actually, that's right. A lot of them are actually calling for no women's prisons at all. A few will sort of throw this in and say, "Oh, you might have to have one for a small number of women or something like that." Yeah. But yeah, in general, their push is towards trying to say that prison isn't appropriate for women. Now, I would actually generalize that and say that in a lot of cases prison isn't appropriate for a lot of people who are in prison, including a lot of men, right? So if they were, and I've said this to them, if you took a non-gendered approach on this, I would most likely agree with a lot of what you're saying. Okay, not about getting rid of all prisons, but most prisons, right? But they don't. They do it in a gendered manner. So unfortunately, whereas I think that. So my view is that the idea of locking someone up as a punishment is relatively new. I mean, societies would lock people up to hold them so they couldn't run away, before they were punished, right? And then, of course, this idea of locking people up to as a punishment. But I'm really concerned about the psychological harm of long-term imprisonment and so forth. You hear a lot of stories about how hard it is for people to go back into society. Again, there are always a few people who there's no alternative. You've got to lock them up. But I am concerned about that. And one thing that we've never actually talked about this. One idea I've thought about over the years is whether imprisonment is truly intrinsically worse than corporal punishment, for example. I mean, we say that whipping someone as a punishment is wrong and immoral and so forth, but we're quite happy to lock them in a box for 20 years. And I'm concerned about that sort of approach. So that I think if we're going to say one's harmful, maybe physically harmful, the other's psychologically harmful. So again, there's some people who need to be, but no.
Right. But I was actually kind of thinking of something I had a thought of recently is the idea of corporal punishment. Now that it's brought. Well, the problem is the state makes too many mistakes for that to be for the state to actually handle the death of people. In my personal opinion,
well, I would call that capital punishment.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm confusing the term. I'm sorry.
Whereas corporal punishment is basically physical punishment, pain.
All right, my mistake. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I on the capital punishment, I absolutely agree. I oppose capital punishment not because I intrinsically oppose the death penalty as a punishment for a sufficiently severe crime, but because the state gets it wrong too often. That's absolutely the reason why I oppose death penalty. Yeah.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Right. And so kind of weighing these things, the psychological harm of imprisonment and the actual brutality of the capital punishment. I'm trying to get my terms right now. Yeah. So I guess I'm not saying turn imprisonment into a country club, right? But I think more rehabilitative efforts should be considered, I think.
I agree. Absolutely. Education. So I mean, it's going back a long way now, but I once heard a story about, I think that some European countries have much lower reoffence rates, I believe, than say Australia does in relation to, so people have gone to prison and their likelihood of reoffending. And I read something about a Dutch politician or something who was horrified at Australia's relatively high reoffence rate for people who are in prison until they found out the country was founded as a prison colony. So I think they argued that we've inherited these sort of severe prisons. So I mean, without checking the latest data, my understanding is the reoffence rate in some European countries is quite low, and it does seem they take a different approach to imprisonment. And like that, more of a focus on rehabilitation, education. Often low. A lot of the time, it's especially for small-time offenders, have relatively low education levels, higher literacy rates. If you can get that education level up, I think you can probably get them hopefully get them into the workforce.
Exactly. Yeah. So, so I was thinking more about the effects of imprisonment. So, in light of this, I kind of want to get your opinion on this. What is the purpose of imprisonment? Is it more for the prisoner, or is it the fact that we're just keeping the prisoner away from the public?
So I think a lot of societies can't decide what the purpose of imprisonment is. So on the one hand, there are always people, as we've established, always people who must simply be contained. But beyond that, you could say rehabilitation is a major driver. You would hope so. Yeah. But of course, punishment too. So I mean, I think that's reflected in sentencing too. For example, if your plan is to rehabilitate someone rather than punish them, is 20 years appropriate? Maybe 5 years might be a better thing to rehabilitate them. But if you're giving them 20 years, you're probably punishing them. So, but I do think that society sort of lurches from one to the other, and pretty much a lot of the time simply can't decide what the purpose of imprisonment is.
Okay. Now, I don't know if I should bring this up because this makes for a good story idea, but and somebody might kind of take and run with it. But I'm going to say it anyway because it's kind of funny. Like a friend and I, he's big into like film and like amateur script writing and stuff like that, right? Like it's not gone anywhere. We just kind of like to bounce ideas off it. And so I bring this up because I was thinking about what imprisonment does for different people, right? This isolation. So this kind of like this thriller movie idea of a sociopathic guy who just wants peace and quiet, right? And he doesn't get his peace and quiet, and he snaps and goes on like killing sprees or something like that towards the end. And it kind of builds up, right? But as he gets into prison, he finally has his peace and quiet. I know, it's just entertaining premise.
That could make for a very dark short movie, actually. Maybe you should consider that. Yes.
It's pretty funny, right? Of course, maybe part 2 happens when he gets more boisterous cellmates.
He never gets his peace and quiet. We discovered in the follow-up, he never gets his peace and quiet.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead. You were saying something.
Oh no, I was going to say, have you ever heard of a Panopticon? This is a term that just came to mind.
I heard the term. There's I've heard the term. It's kind of, I think I have some vague understanding of it. Kind of like an all-seeing eye, sort of.
Yeah, so there might be multiple meanings, but one particular meaning was actually a design of a prison in the 19th century. And the idea was that basically the prisoners were watched all the time. And I think they actually did build a couple of these, and they would have a relatively small. The other selling point was you didn't need many guards because the whole thing was basically designed so a small number of guards could be watching the prisoners all the time. But in the end, and I think there were actually a couple of sort of modern equivalents, I recall actually, where they built a couple of trial prisons, small ones, where they basically had cameras everywhere and the prisoners were being watched all the time. But in the end, I think they had a lot of problems with it. I think they actually considered it sort of quite invasive, even in the 19th century. I think there was the people turned against this idea, and it was, at the time they wouldn't have called it a violation of their human rights, but I think it didn't actually work out quite well at all, actually. So anyway, there was this idea of Panopticon of basically watching the prisoners all the time. So they would be designed so basically one wall of their cell was open to the prison guards, and they could be seen at all times.
Right.
Yes. Anyway, I guess just touching on that idea of prison designs and experimentation. So
right. Have you seen the Deep Space Nine episode Hard Time?
I've seen the whole thing. So yes, is that something to do with Miles O'Brien
It's
being
one of
punished?
the Miles O'Brien must suffer episodes.
Yes. For those who don't know, poor Miles O'Brien is one of those characters that everyone thinks the writers must really hate. Yes.
Right, or they just love to torture. But
Exactly.
so the premise of the episode is that, well, Miles O'Brien is falsely accused for a crime in some world, right? And their mode of punishment is to inject a prison sentence's worth of memory
Yes.
in a short space of time. And the explanation they give is that this saves on prison space.
Yeah. Very efficient. That's right.
Right, but it's pretty brutal. It's actually one of
Yeah.
the least comfortable episodes to watch, actually, because it's really
Yes. I
dramatic.
agree, actually.
Right.
It is a very good episode, actually.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But the one thing I object about the episode is that it doesn't seem to matter in future episodes, because that's not a small thing, to have that kind of, I can't even imagine. But
That's right. So
yeah,
you get PT. I mean, the experiences he had, which were essentially accelerated in his mind. So he perceived the entire thing as happening.
mm-hmm.
And I think it was about 20 years or something that he was supposed to
something like that.
But it was about half an hour, and he's come out and he's got 20 years of memories. Of course, there was a different episode with Jean-Luc Picard where an entire lifetime was beamed into his brain.
Yeah, right.
And all he got out of it was that he learned to play the piccolo. So
yeah. Well, he did reference it in other episodes, so at least that mattered. But we never talked about it again for the Hard Time thing, the Miles O'Brien one. So
no, fair enough. You're right.
That was kind of a cop out. I'm sorry.
Yeah, with that, we're right. With Jean-Luc Picard, it was talked about a few times, but in both cases, the two characters should have had PTSD after those experiences.
Yep.
So,
yeah.
So it's a shame they didn't follow. I mean, Star Trek has got some great ideas, but they do have a bit of a habit of sort of letting those sorts of things go, unfortunately.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
Yes. Exactly. I get the impression sometimes they're short stories that were sort of bolted in as episodes. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, you're right. It was never mentioned again, I know, was it? That's right, even though he effectively has 20 extra years of memory that can't be removed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That is no small deal. It isn't.
No, exactly. That's right. That's right. And it messes with anybody. His personality would be most likely significantly different. And if it was real life, he'd most likely his marriage would break down, and he'd probably start drinking too much, and
right, yeah. Which is a problem because it's all synthahol in the Star Trek world. Right. Real alcohol is hard to come by.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's not true. I mean, you can go to the Klingons; they got like really strong stuff. But
that's true. You get it some places. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, do we have anything else we wanted to discuss tonight or today?
Well, we have some plans for next time, don't we? Should we? Is there a little bit we can discuss without giving it too much away?
Yeah, I think so. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, we're in touch with somebody from the transmaxxing community, so we're gonna have this person talk about their views and their experiences and whatever we can kind of come up with, because we've got 2 weeks. We'll come up with some interesting questions. And it's going to be under this men's issues perspective as well. We're going to try and see if we can tie these ends here.
Yeah, exactly. It should be a really interesting discussion. And the definition of transmaxxing is on Wiki for Men at the moment, I believe. In fact, I'm quite certain it is.
Yeah, right. And if it's not, we'll make it and we'll put it in the description.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sure that I'm quite certain that I think Peter wrote the article. It's not
Right. Okay. Well, anything else on your list?
No, that's it. That's my list done for tonight. So I think we got through a decent amount of material there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that was a good discussion.
We'll see you in 2 weeks for the transmaxxing discussion.
Yep, sounds good. All right. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.